What's up, everyone? Welcome to our study of Daniel. Today will be primarily background and history. I just want to give us some runway into leading into this book and the historical context of why this book is important. Daniel is a Hebrew name, which means God is my judge, or only God can judge me. Daniel is one of the major prophets, and his book is significant in understanding world history and the stage in the stages of historical power on the world scene, and significant in helping us understand also the book of Revelation. Both Revelation and Daniel are apocalyptic books, which mean they're books that are meant to uncover something that for a time God had always left concealed. And so thanks for joining us. Thanks for reading ahead if you have. And we'll just get into this a little bit. May the Lord Jesus open our eyes to see the beauty and significance of this book, of how it fits into history, and how it tells of the coming of a kingdom which will never end. May this buoy our souls as we remember this, that even if all around gives way, that Jesus is my hope and stay. Lord, help us in your name. Amen. So, like I said, Daniel is one of the major prophets. Daniel lived the same period of time that Jeremiah lived the same period of time that Ezekiel lived, and he was quite the young man. Revelation is about the unfolding or the uncovering of things in future history, or the history of the church. And I think it's important to read and understand Daniel before we go too deeply into Revelation, right? Because there's some symbols and apocalyptic language that we should understand and learn from Daniel, and also from the Old Testament prophets, that'll help us understand some of the language in the book of Revelation. Okay. The literary style of Daniel is often used when prophesying of world events. Understanding Revelation begins with understanding Daniel, and that's just an encouragement that you will receive from me. And so I want to start with a little bit of a historical background on the history of Israel as she relates to Daniel. Okay, so listen, I'm gonna start at the beginning of the history of Israel. Right after the Judges, Israel didn't have a king, and they begged God to have a king. They begged God for a king like the nations, even though God had been presenting Himself as their king. So in 1060 BC, God has Samuel anoint Saul over the tribes of Israel, over the 12 tribes of Israel. And, Saul, when Samuel first came to anoint Saul, it says that he was hiding among the baggage. So that starts off a little bit of what we're going to expect and see in the life of this guy who was head and shoulders above the rest. He was handsome and he was strong, but he had some character issues, some really deep character issues. But for 40 years, he ruled Israel, all 12 tribes. They were united under Saul. And then in 1020 BC, David replaces Saul as the king of Israel. He's the king who subdued the lands, who fortified and built the borders, and there was a lot of prosperity under David. There was a lot of peace under David. Obviously after years of war. And then unfortunately, at the end of David's life, there began to be war within, right? Among him and his own sons and him and his own people. And then Solomon comes to rule after 40 years under David. There's Solomon. Solomon comes to rule. And for 40 years, there was a golden period, right? Where Israel was the strongest. Israel was the richest. And people from all over the world came to consult Solomon's wisdom. Not just people in Israel, but from all over the world, they came to listen to the wise Solomon. And for 40 years, they were prospering. And Solomon followed after the ways of David, his God, except in the way of horses, the way of plunder, and the way of women. But in 940 BC, so that was 980, Solomon became king. For 40 years he ruled. But in 940 BC, Solomon dies. There's a civil war between his son and others. And this is where we begin to see the fractured kingdom, the divided kingdom, right? There were 10 tribes in the north that became known as Israel. And their capitals were Shechem, Penuel, and Tisra at different points. And they were called Israel. And then there were 2 tribes in the south. Their capital was Jerusalem. The north, like I said, was called Israel. The south was called Judah. And they never reunited ever again after this split. But they competed for power in the region. And there were a lot of times where Israel would collaborate with neighboring enemies to fight against Judah or to try to overthrow Judah. And then, so there was a lot of hatred that developed between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. After the split, there was moral and religious decay and infidelity to Yahweh, infidelity to the Lord. Somewhat faithful under Solomon. The kingdom was somewhat faithful under Solomon, but after the split, the north especially went into extreme idolatry. And then I want to tell you that during all this time, during the development of the story of Israel, even before the kings, even before David, even before Saul, there was one world power that dominated the world scene politically, militarily, and culturally for about 500 years, between the 1400s BC and 940 BC. And that is the kingdom or the empire of the Assyrians. The Assyrians' capital was just north of Israel. It was in Nineveh. And we've heard about Nineveh in the story of Jonah. But Nineveh is all over the Old Testament. But that was the world dominating power at the time of Israel's development, at the time of the judges, at the time of the priests and the prophets right before Saul. And the Jews often had to fight off or pay tribute to the Assyrians. Remember the story of Jonah. That's why Jonah hated them so much. That's why Jonah didn't want to go preach mercy to them. Because Jonah knew that God would save people that believed in him. But Jonah wanted God to punish and destroy Nineveh. Right? Why he hated them so much is because they were unkind. They were oppressors, and they were enemies of the people. And so Jonah ran, and according to the story, God offered him a deal he couldn't refuse in the belly of the whale. So he got spit up out of the whale, and he finally went to do what God had called him to do, even though the last thing Jonah wanted was their salvation. but God had his way, even with that man. So, again, 940 is when the split happened. And now for more than 100 years, more than 200 years, the kingdoms were divided. And then in 722 BC, Syria attacked and destroyed the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes. They scattered the people among other nations. It was their style of conquest. Their style of conquest was to send captive people to other nations, to dilute their nationalism. They would intermarry. They would adopt new cultures. They would adopt new foods. They would adopt new history. They would adopt new religions, and that was the way that the Assyrians would conquer and dilute nationalism out of a people that they conquered. Their goal was to dissolve any idea of the old ways of life. Their hope was that in a few generations, the people would have less connection to the old ways. Sound familiar? But Assyria also brought in foreigners and allowed them to live in the lands of the conquered. And that's how the Samaritans were developed. Remember, the 12 tribes of Israel were up north. And so Assyria would bring in foreign people, foreign blood, foreign cultures, foreign religions. And these people would live among the people of Israel. And what happened was Judaism got mixed with paganism. And the Jews in Israel, in the 12 tribes, in the 10 northern tribes, began to intermingle, intermarry, and then they developed this mixed breed, which the Jews hated. They were known as the Samaritans. Israel would eventually collaborate with other nations against Judah and Jerusalem, which is another layer to why there was so much bad blood between the two. So that sacking of Israel, that attacking of Israel by the Assyrians happened in 722 BC. Then in 712, the Babylonians, listen to this, Assyrians were in control. But then in 612, so 722 to 612, that's 110 years, the Babylonians came and destroyed Nineveh and established themselves as the new world power. So for 110 years, Assyria had control over Israel and had control over the cultures and the people until the Babylonians came in. And then 6 years later, Nebuchadnezzar captured Jerusalem in the south, right? So the Babylonians destroyed in 612 Nineveh and established themselves as the world power. Therefore, they were already reigning and ruling over an oppressed Israel, the 10 northern tribes. But then the 2 southern tribes were captured by Nebuchadnezzar in 606. That's Jerusalem. That's the sacking of Jerusalem, the taking of people into captivity. And what Nebuchadnezzar did was he carried off the best and the brightest, and he took temple gold. And if you read the beginning of the book of Daniel, it literally says that God is the one who did it. Like God is the one who allowed it. It's crazy to read, but we got to read these things. Otherwise, we're thinking to ourselves that somehow God has allowed calamity to fall upon His people. And so, sorry, I just want to read what it says in the first 2 verses of Daniel. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. 2. And the Lord gave King Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into Nebuchadnezzar's hand, with some of the vessels of the house of God, the gold vessels, and some also made of wood and other materials, in the treasury of his God. With some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. It sounds crazy. But the text says that God delivered Jehoiakim into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. And the text says that he allowed Nebuchadnezzar to take the vessels from the temple. And if, think about it. If people were there in that time, they'd be fighting against that. Yet, God wasn't fighting. God wasn't fighting. So he carried off the best and brightest and the temple gold, and it was allowed by God. In 626, Jeremiah, 20 years before this happened, Jeremiah prophesied this would happen in Jeremiah chapter 25. He prophesies 70 years of captivity. 70 years of captivity. And it was true. It all happened according to Jeremiah's prophecy. I told you a little bit about how Assyria conquers people. Babylon's style of conquest was different from that of Assyria. I told you that what Assyria does is they overtake a people, then they scatter them abroad. But Babylon is different. What Babylon does is they take the cream of the crop. They take the best and the brightest. They take them to Babylon in hopes of re-educating and deprogramming them. And reprogramming them into Babylon's culture, Babylon's history, Babylon's literature, Babylon's arts, Babylon's religions. Their hope is that they would reprogram them towards full loyalty and influence, and then send them back to re-educate and deprogram and reprogram the people in their own lands. So that's Babylon's style. So that's why they didn't take all the people of Judah. They only took the best and the brightest, and that included Daniel. So Daniel was among them. He was definitely among the best and the brightest, but his true value to Babylon was not in mathematics or in history or in science. His true value to Nebuchadnezzar was in his ability, in his giftedness to interpret dreams. Ezekiel was also carried off during this time, became prophet to those in exile, while Jeremiah stayed back and was the prophet to those in Judah during the exile. So these three prophets all lived during the same time. God allowed all this and yet still provided for his people's spiritual need. Do you see that? God allowed for Jerusalem to be conquered and for the best and brightest to be carried away. Yet, he provided still for their spiritual nourishment. A prophet remained in Judah. A prophet went into Babylon. A prophet was right inside the king's palace. It's pretty crazy. Daniel lived in the palace and influenced Nebuchadnezzar. Ezekiel lived among the people and ministered to them with his teachings and prophecies. As a matter of fact, it was during this captivity that the Jews developed the idea of synagogue. The people didn't want to lose their faith and connection to God's truth and worship, so they began to meet in homes for prayer, for edification, for praise, and for worship. Sound familiar? When they came back to rebuild after the exile, they brought back the idea and practice of synagogue. Got a few more dates I want to throw at you, and then we're going to wrap it up. So again, that was in 606. Nebuchadnezzar took over Jerusalem. And then 586 BC, 20 years later, King Zedekiah rebelled against Babylon. So Babylon ended up destroying Jerusalem and the temple and carried off even more people into captivity. In 539 BC, that's another 47 years later, almost 50, the Medes and their king Cyrus conquered Babylon, right? So the Medes now are the new world power. And Cyrus allows the Jews to go back home, and he provides all kinds of favor, right? You can read that in the books of Ezra and the books of Nehemiah. And in 534, Daniel dies in Babylon, now controlled by the Medes. From about 500 to 332, the Medes shared world domination with Persia. And there you have the Medo-Persian Empire. So the Medo-Persian Empire was a collaboration between the Medes and the Persians. In 400 BC, according to Old Testament history, in 400 BC, the Old Testament history ends. Malachi the prophet is the one who speaks in that time. And then there are two more historically significant events happening on the world stage before Christ. First of all, 331 BC, Alexander the Great, there are a lot of movies made about this guy, conquers Persia. Alexander the Great, the emperor of Greece, the Grecian Empire, is now the one who is dominating the world. And eventually Greece. And Greece will dominate for almost 200 years. It is said of Alexander the Great that he died of a broken heart because there were no more nations to conquer. So, I don't know if that's true. I mean, I know that that's not true. But the fact that this quote is alluded to describing the kind of man he was, that he lived only to conquer. And thus the name Alexander the Great. So Greece was in world power from 331 BC until 146 BC, when Rome destroys Carthage and becomes the new world power for the next 500 years. And so I'm going to start winding it down. So it's important to understand, and there's a reason I told you that whole historical timeline, right? There's a story within a story being told here. The story of the Jews, right? The story of God in relation to Israel. The story of God in relation to his people. That's the story. That's one of the stories that's found in threaded throughout the book of Daniel and throughout biblical history, right? But most notably here in the book of Daniel, there's a story of God's people. But there's a second story within that story, the story of world kingdoms. These world kingdoms are not necessarily detailed in the Bible. When we read the Bible, what we're getting in the forefront is the story of God and his people, right? But in the background, kind of like scenery, is the story of these 5 kingdoms. These 5 kingdoms. Like I said, Assyria, Babylon, Media, Persia, Greece, and Rome, right? Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome, right? And much of Daniel's dreams. Oh, but let me tell you why this is significant. This prophecy, this book is so significant for us to study. Much of Daniel's dreams chronicle the rise and fall of these world powers, and eventually the coming of the Christian age and the end of all things as the final kingdom, according to Daniel's prophecies, we're going to read about between chapter 7 and 12, has no end. The final kingdom has no end. There's a significant connection of Daniel's prophecies to worldwide events throughout history that historical records can attest to. The existence of Assyria as a world dominating power, the existence of Babylon as a world dominating power, the existence of Medo-Persia as a world dominating power, the existence of Alexander the Great and Greece as a world dominating power, and the existence of the Caesars and Rome as a world dominating power. These have historical connection and have historical record attests to these things being so. It's amazing. And Daniel prophesies the rise and fall of the next 4 secular kingdoms in history and nails the order in a row and the names of the kingdoms. And this should tell us that the Bible is not just another book. Can you say amen? It's a special book. Another significance of this, the study of Daniel, is the language, imagery, and symbols in Daniel are necessary to understand and read Revelation. We can't make Revelation mean what we want without at least a studied understanding of Daniel and Old Testament prophecy. Make an effort to study it. Make an effort to study and familiarize ourselves with Daniel and the Old Testament before we dive headlong into Revelation and say that something that John is seeing is a helicopter. The first rule of faithful Bible study is to ask, what did this mean to the people to whom it was originally addressed? We should always do that. We should learn that first, then we can seek to learn and apply the text to ourselves in our current context. And then I'm going to end with this summary. All right? Daniel wrote the book of Daniel. Daniel was a young man from an upper middle class family. You could tell that by his education, by his nobility, by his mannerisms, by his astute commitment to the religion of his parents. Between 606 and 534, when he died, he wrote this material. The book is written in 2 languages, Hebrew and Aramaic. The Hebrew section is chapter 1. The Aramaic sections are 2 through 7. And then the Hebrew, again, section is 8 through 12. And then the book is divided into 3 sections. Right? I want you to think of these in this way. Introduction, that's chapter 1. Chapter 1 is actually kind of like a table of contents, right? It just chronicles Daniel's career from the beginning to the end of verse 21, I think. And then chapters 2 through 6 is history, right? The history. What did we do? Where did we go? What happened while we were there? And then chapters 7 through 12 are the prophecy. The history section 2 through 6 is a little easier to understand. The prophecy section 7 through 12 is a little harder section. But it talks about the kingdoms that are in Daniel's dreams. And I love it because it introduces the kingdom that never ends, God's kingdom. And with that, welcome to our study of Daniel. Next week, we're going to go through chapter 1, and then we'll go from there. God bless. See you guys.